Hi everyone, I hope this finds you well. Wishing you a wonderful Shabbos, you and your families. This is the Dvar Torah for Shabbos Parshas Noach, here for Tafshin Pei Aleph 5781. We are told of course, the flood, the aftermath of the flood. And I would like to focus our attention on immediately what happens to Noach and his family as soon as it's over. What is the communication? What is the guidance the Almighty gives to him? After all, we are living in a time now of great difficulty, and we look at Noach and the challenges of mass destruction that he experienced, and perhaps we can get some insight into what Hashem told him. And more than that, how does Noach go about strengthening his family, strengthening his home, connecting his home? And so, please turn your attention to chapter 9. Chapter 9, right after Hashem promises to never destroy the world again, and proves that with the presence of a rainbow, Noach is told to have children. Pru'ervu, famous line, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the land. Hashem says that your offspring will prosper. They will be on top of the animal kingdom. Fear not. And then we're told in chapter 9, don't eat blood, don't shed blood. Life, in a sense, is sacred, but B'Tselem Elokim, man is made in God's image. And take part in creation. Be a partner with the Almighty. But what's confounding, and the point for us to focus on, is that just 6 sentences later, chapter 9, verse 7, Pasuk Zayin, V'atem pru'ervu. It says it a second time, be fruitful and multiply. And why would that be the case, that Noach is told twice? And this is a fascinating consideration. Rashi alludes to some of the answer. The Or HaChaim, an important medieval commentator, alludes to part of the answer. The Maharal, in his explanation, Maharal from Prague, alludes to part of the answer as well. And when it comes to being fruitful, when it comes to multiplying, so when a man has relations with his wife, so we look at Noach specifically, and we know in the previous chapter there was so much destruction in the world. Our tradition is that Noach could not, in good conscience, and his wife could not engage in relations with each other considering what was going on. Indeed, there are some who are strict with themselves in their own households, and they have a stringency not to engage in relations during times of great global distress, such as today. And we're told at the end of chapter 8 that there was another part to this, that the Almighty told them that they were now permitted to have relations. First, it was advised that they not have relations. After the flood was over, they were advised to have relations. But it didn't stop there. In chapter 9, we're told, despite the way they must have felt, having lost all their friends, having lost everything, Hashem tells Noach that he and his wife, and it's a mitzvah, chapter 9, verse 1, pru'ervu, to go ahead and have relations. But then, in verse 7, when it says pru'ervu again, so Noach and his wife are being told that it's an obligation for them to go ahead and have relations. And so we have this 4-stage process where it was prohibited, and it was permissible, then it went from permissible to a mitzvah, and then it went from being a mitzvah to an obligation. And indeed, the Or HaChaim says that in verse 7 it says, Atem, it says, you, pru'ervu, be fruitful and multiply. What it's saying is that Hashem said, I'm doing something. When humanity rebels against me, I'm going to withhold the destruction. I'm not going to be involved in destruction, and I'm going to hold back the destruction that comes from mankind's great rebellion against the Almighty, against creation, against the Creator. Now you too, you need to do something. You need to be productive. You need to build. And indeed, the Gemara tells us that in a sense, that a person, when they get married, if they are actively involved, if they make an intentional commitment to avoid procreation, then in a sense they're diminishing the Almighty, says the Gemara. They're actively involved in saying, we don't really believe that man is made in the image of God, and we're not going to further humanity accordingly. What's fascinating, perhaps a separate topic, is that the author of this teaching, Ben Azai, one of the great sages from the Gemara, he himself remained a bachelor his whole life, and his colleagues take issue with him, and that's a separate discussion. Another teaching about this verse is that Gemara tells us Mashiach will come. Ravasi says Mashiach will come when all the people who needed to be born are born. That's a cryptic statement, hard to understand with the rational mind, but that is the statement, that there are a certain number of people who need to have been created, or certain specific people that need to be born before Mashiach comes. It underscores the importance of procreation. And indeed, somebody who actively is involved in withholding offspring or stopping themselves from having offspring is in a sense shedding life. So there's actually a practical implication of this from the Gemara in Ksubis. Gemara tells us a very technical detail, and it brings us to a time when in Jewish history people didn't have such largesse, they didn't have such luxury. Oftentimes, instead of creating a separate feast and party for the wedding, they would get married on Friday. Get married on Friday, Erev Shabbos, and their Shabbos meal and their wedding meal would be one meal, and they would save money. The Gemara tells us that biologically, when a virgin has relations, then there's bleeding, and a person can't cause bleeding on Shabbos, but because it is a mitzvah, it overrides Shabbos. A technical detail, but one that underscores that even though it's said here in Parshas Noach, it is expected of us that we understand that the mitzvah is real, it's practical, it's a way for us to go ahead and serve the Almighty, and it underscores and emphasizes some of the points that we just made. There's a more important point that I would like us to conclude with, and that is, how does one deal with tragedy? How does one deal with loss? How does one rebuild? How does one strengthen their connection to humanity and their home? And one looks at our Sedra, and one looks at the very next verse, chapter 9, verse 8. And it begins to tell us that there's going to be an agreement. And there's going to be an agreement, and Hashem promises Noach his children are going to live with a formal covenant. And you and I might wonder, why is this formal covenant not the beginning of chapter 9? Let the mitzvah of procreation and all of that, everything, let that come after. And the answer is sometimes the abstract is hard for us to wrap our head around. God makes a promise, a covenant to Noach, that's great. But to a great extent, Noach has to, and the survivors of the flood have to be involved in something practical. They have to make sure that they go about and they move and do what's right. Sometimes people, they're stricken by what takes place. And indeed, during this flood, no doubt Noach and his family were completely traumatized. And so therefore, sometimes you need to go through the actions. And by performing the act, even though you're not motivated to do so, and Hashem says, I know you don't feel like focusing on these actions, on the future right now. So instead, we'll focus on the action. And after we focus on the action, then psychologically, you'll be ready to understand the abstract idea of having a promise or covenant made. And it's hard to move forward. It's hard to move on. And sometimes just putting one foot in front of the other. And sometimes just proverbially just doing the next action and the next action. A person can begin to heal. And Noach healed, and his family healed, and Hashem led them on that path by showing them, hey, these are the actions to take. Perform these actions, and then psychologically you'll be in a better place to understand the covenant that is the Almighty's eternal relationship with mankind. Thank you very much, and have a great Shabbos.